Where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? It's the title of our series, but it's also the question that we're asking that Dr. King raised some 60 years ago. Where do we go from right here, right now? Where do we go from here? If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. My name's Michael. We are in a series on race and racism and justice and what the Word of God says about it. But this is not our first conversation about it. In fact, we began this last Sunday in our first installment of it, this part one of it, by diving into this idea that we must be broke before we're woke. That really where all of this starts, if we're ever going to see equality, if we're ever going to see justice, if racism is going to have its stranglehold on people broken, that we have to get broke before we get woke. If you missed that or need to watch it again, it's on our YouTube channel. You should watch it. But today, we are going to dive in and address some terms and the implications of them that I believe are so important right now. We're going to deal with privilege, advantage, and leverage. Similar, but completely different. And so I'm going to ask you to walk with me over the next few moments, because I want to help us wrestle with the implications of all of these, because the difference between privilege and leverage, and there is a difference. The difference between privilege and leverage is recognition of advantage. That really is the difference. The difference between privilege and leverage is recognition of advantage. Now, it's going to take me a few minutes to help break this apart. So I'm going to ask you just to give me a little time today. Maybe you've been in church for a minute. I remember being in church when I was a kid, and sometimes somebody would shout, "Take your time, preacher." So if you're with me today, would somebody in the chat just say, "Take your time, preacher," because I'm going to need a minute to walk through this, okay? So don't tune me out, don't cut me off, but just help me in that chat and say, "Take your time, preacher." Because there is a difference between privilege and leverage, and it is the recognition of advantage. Because advantage exists. To act like some people do not have advantages in this world, in this life, because of things that we have esteemed, because of policies that have been set up, because of systems that are at work, is ridiculous. There are people that have advantages because advantage exists. In fact, all of us have advantage of some sort. It shows up in one place and shows up in another. Advantage exists, but here's what I want us to get today. And if you're taking notes, write this down. If you want to download the notes, you can download them from our worship guide and follow along. That would be great. But unrecognized advantage always becomes privilege. Anytime you or I do not recognize the advantage that we have in any space or sphere of life, anytime we do not recognize it and look it in the face and say, "Yes, I am advantaged here. Yes, things are a little easier for me here. Yes, things are a lot easier for me here." Anytime we do not recognize the advantage that we have, the only place that leads us to is a place of privilege. Why? Because that's what the definition of privilege is. Here is how privilege is defined: as a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group. So it's this advantage that comes to me or comes to a group of people or comes to those people simply because of something going on, but it stays with them. And unless you recognize that you have an advantage, it always turns to privilege. But recognized advantage potentially becomes leverage. And I sincerely believe that there is a difference between privilege and leverage, because also the definition of terms is quite different. And yes, unrecognized advantage always becomes privilege, but recognized advantage, when you see and begin to process and look and go, oh, I do have an advantage. There is the potential to take that advantage and turn it into leverage, because here is what leverage is. It's to use something to its maximum advantage. And I would like to add to it, for the context of our time today, for the context of these conversations around race and racism and justice and equality, that it's to its maximum advantage for the most people. To leverage the advantage I have, to leverage the advantage you may have for the good of the most people. You see, because that you have an advantage has actually nothing to do with you. There were systems in place long before you got here. Come on, great athletes in our country. If you have any athletic ability, you can hit a baseball. Come on, you can shoot a hockey puck. You play tennis, basketball, whatever. A lot of that advantage that you receive as a world-class athlete comes because our society has said athletes are awesome and we will pay them lots of money to perform on their stages in their arenas, and we will watch them. That you have an advantage has nothing to do with you. Our world said that matters right now. But here's what I need all of us to recognize. What you do with an advantage has everything to do with you. What you do with whatever the advantage is that you may have has everything to do with you. And everybody has an advantage somewhere. And I want you to catch this heart before we dive into the scripture together today. It's that when and how you use your advantage determines whether your advantage is for your own privilege or it's used as leverage for the advantage of those who don't have the advantage that you have. How and when you use your privilege, your advantage, determines whether or not it becomes this privilege just for you, or it helps a whole bunch of other people in the process. This isn't just my idea, though. You see this very clearly in the life and ministry of Jesus, and today I want to turn our attention to an encounter in his life that some of you will be familiar with. It's one of those stories a lot of people know about Jesus. Things just get thrown out around him connected to this. But if you've never heard this account truly contextually explained, you'll never see it the same again. Mark chapter 11 is where we're going to be. Let me read a few verses and just dive into this account, and then I will explain it to us as we go. Okay, if you're with me, say, read on, preacher. Mark 11, starting in verse 15. They arrived at Jerusalem. This is Jesus and his disciples. They arrived at Jerusalem. It says, immediately on entering the temple, Jesus started throwing out everyone who had set up shop there, buying and selling. He kicked over the tables of the bankers and the stalls of the pigeon merchants. He didn't let anyone even carry a basket through the temple. And then he taught them, quoting this text, "My house was designed as a house of prayer for all the nations. You have turned it into a hangout for thieves." The high priest and religion scholars heard what was going on, and they plotted how they might get rid of him. They panicked, for the entire crowd was carried away by his teaching. This is an off-catching story about Jesus. It is. Because a lot of people, our picture of Jesus is humble and lowly, it's meek and mild, it's away in a manger. And when Jesus comes in and he flexes out and starts flipping over tables, it's like, whoa, Jesus got aggressive. Yes, he did. But you don't even know the half of why. I mean, because some people hear this and go, well, are you saying that Jesus got really angry because there was like a pet shop, gift shop situation going on in the church? Nah, man, it's so much more than that. I know some people, though, maybe they were told one time by a preacher like me saying, well, the reason you can't sell cookies after the worship service today is because if Jesus walked in, he'd turn over your cookie table. Wrong answer. Is way more to it than that. And it starts with how the temple was actually set up. You know, every building, every structure has a design to it, right? And the temple had that. The temple had these layer system of courts. That if you came into the temple, you were in the outer courts. And then you moved into the inner courts. And then there were inner places from there, centering around and all being built around a place called the Holy of Holies, where the presence of God was, the Ark of the Covenant was, and the high priest, one man, went in one time a year to offer sacrifice for all people's sins for the year on that Day of Atonement. It was a special and significant place. But through their rules and policies and religious nature, they had decided that they were going to keep these sectioned off places and use them as ways to sort of keep one group of people over here and another group of people over there. To allow some people access because of their ethnicity, because of their gender, because of even some under the table stuff that would go on connected to their social standing. And so you could be in one place if you were a certain person, but you couldn't go there maybe because of your gender. Oh, you're a woman, you can't come in here. Or, oh, you want to come in, this is fine, but, oh, you're not a Jew? It became a racial thing. You can't come in here. And that's how the temple was set up. When Jesus comes in on this day, and had come in on all days, what he would see is he would see people coming to the temple to worship God, because that's what they did. They had to go to the temple to worship God. And so they came and they wanted to worship and they wanted to bring an offering to God. So they had these opportunities for them to get offerings. What was happening, though, is if you were a Jewish male, let's say, there would be an opportunity a few layers into this temple where women couldn't go, where Gentiles couldn't go, where you could get your offering. And historians have let us know that in there, that's where actually the best sacrifices were. The best pigeons, the best offerings, or the most unblemished animals that would be offered to God, they were available there at a price. But in the outer courts, where Gentiles, where all women, all people could go, there would also be opportunities to buy these offerings. But typically they would be a lesser quality and more expensive, historians have told us, typically than what would go on inside the temple. You say, what's that called? Well, let me give it to you in a very modern term. That is called exploitation. That is taking advantage of people who are coming sincerely to worship God, need to worship God, want to worship God, to be made right with God, and you're charging them more for less out here because they're not a certain gender, not a certain race. That's a problem. And if you think that's crazy, because that's what made Jesus mad, you're only beginning to get the story. That's what's going on here. Jesus is seeing people exploited because they're Gentiles who want to worship God, but yet they're being charged more. They're being given a less opportunity, and it's not right. But here's what I want you to see. This is what I don't want you to miss, because I'm not done. This system, because that's what that was, this system that was set up did not affect Jesus personally until he stood up. Jesus was a Jewish male who was also a rabbi, a teacher of sorts. Even though a lot of the high priests and religious officials didn't like him, he still had a following. He was still a teacher. That's what he did. Essentially, Jesus could go anywhere he wanted to in the temple. If there's a special on offerings for like Jesus himself could take advantage of it. This didn't become a problem for Jesus until Jesus stood up. See, but for Jesus, his standing up, his turning over tables wasn't about him. It was about the heart of his God, the heart of his Father, and about people around him who were being taken advantage of, people around him who were being exploited. And he said, I'm going to use my advantage for the good of people that do not have the advantage that I have. Our country, America, from its founding documents, has created a system and structure that brings the most advantage to Anglo-Saxon males. It just does. The man who wrote the Constitution, who penned that beautiful vision that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. A beautiful vision. Did not believe the words that he wrote enough because he himself owned men, black men, who he would never release, who he would treat horribly, history has recorded. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. If that had always been in place in our country, then why do we need the 13th, 14th, or 15th Amendment almost 100 years later just to begin this conversation? We are in the place that we're in right now as a country in 2020, primarily because the people who look like me, who have been given an advantage, have chosen way more often than not to use it as privilege for themselves rather than leverage for people who weren't given the same advantage. That's why we're in the moment we're in right now. That's why the climate, that's why the issues are what they are, specifically connected to race and equality and fairness and justice, is because the system has set it up to allow benefit to come to people, advantage to come to people who look like me. But if we always choose to use it for our own good, or if we never recognize that we've been given an advantage, it becomes privilege. You see, the difference between privilege and leverage is use of advantage. That's what it is. Any advantage you may have in any sphere of your life, the difference between whether that thing is a privilege for you or leverage that you use to benefit others is literally how you use it. You may have more time right now. Your advantage may be time. It may be time because, well, it's summer and you have summers off. It may be time because you're not going to go back to school next semester because COVID-19 and how's all this going to play. So you're going to take a semester off from school. You may have more time because you're retired. I don't know what it looks like. But you may have the advantage of having more time right now. How you use your time determines whether or not it's a privilege for me to do whatever I want. I'll sleep late every day. Or I'm going to start to leverage this resource that I have that's time for maybe some other people that don't have as much time. Can I tell you, every resource in your life is that way. Money is that way. Some people, they have more money than others, right? We have income inequality. Okay. The thing is that those who may have received more money, those who have access to more resources like that, can either use them for their own good and own world only. That's privilege. But some people who have a lot choose to use it as leverage to give a lot. Whether to give in a church or to give to make a difference in a city, they choose to give a lot. And that's seeing the advantage they have from a resource perspective as not something to be privileged for them, but leverage for the most good possible. Don't keep your advantage to yourself and let it be privilege, but leverage it for the good of others. Turn that advantage to leverage. Now, I know that sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? It sounds like, yeah, why don't we all do that? I'll tell you exactly why. The reason more people don't take their advantage and turn it to leverage is this: cost. Cost. It costs something to take your advantage and say, I'm going to take the advantage given to me and leverage it for the good of people that aren't me. Leverage it for the good of people that may not know me, but I'm going to leverage it. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, your little story here about Jesus, little Mark 11, I don't really see it costing Jesus all that much. He turned over some tables and a bunch of people listened to him teach. Keep reading. This cost Jesus his life. See, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record this account. And this account is at the beginning of the week, where at the end of that week, Jesus would be hanging on a cross because of the kangaroo court and mock trial that went on, dying, yes, for the sins of all humanity, but hanging there, really dying. And what really got people mad was this, and not just this, but Jesus had probably done this before. See, John also records a very similar event like this, Jesus going and turning over tables of money changers. But from a chronological perspective, it seems like in John, he does this early in his ministry, like maybe right at the start. Whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke have it at the end of his ministry. And some very not good historians who are anti-Bible and anti-Jesus have tried to say, it's proof. This is all made up. They got their dates wrong. Psst. This is proof that this issue Jesus had seen. And this issue bothered Jesus. And this issue was at the heart of what God said, this can't be in my house. Because in the moment that Jesus gave up his life, the curtain in the temple that separated the most holy place from all the other places ripped in two. Why did it rip in two? Because his house was designed as a house for all people. So you ain't about to exploit people, not in my house. And Jesus was standing up for it from the start to the end of his ministry. You see, when you recognize your advantage and use it as leverage to help others, it will cost you. So my advantage goes from being my blessing to maybe something that might burden me. Exactly. So my whole life, I've loved music. I'm not musical, not in any way, but I have loved music. And particularly, I have loved hip hop and rap. Like I like a lot of music, but I've always loved that. But as a Christian, I try to lean into the Christian rappers and the rappers and the gospel artists. You know, they point people to Jesus, not some other crazy stuff. I do my best. And there has been a lot of not good music produced, just if we talking music, in the Christian rap world. Like, I have listened to some sorry stuff. I have been handed some sorry CDs up at the gas station by some Christian rappers. That's another day and another story. But I got one standby who's been with me for more than 20 years. He has been so good since the beginning. And he's a guy who some of you may know. He's an artist by the name of Lecrae. Lecrae is got a little Memphis time in him too. He lived in Binghamton for a while, Dallas, and now he lives in Atlanta. But Lecrae has been in the game for a long time. In fact, back in his beginning, he was a part of this group called 116. In fact, in the original drop, it was the 116 Click, which, that has that had one of the funniest lines ever too. In one of the songs they did, 116 did, they had this song, and it talked about exfoliating, right? And he said some folk trying to exfoliate their skin, but only Christ can come exfoliate their sin. What? It was so good. This is like 2001, I think. Like, it was so funny to me. It still makes me laugh when I listen to that. But I've loved Lecrae for a long time. He's produced so many albums. Church Clothes 1, 2, and 3, awesome. Anomaly, fantastic. Rebel is still fire. Rehab, all these albums. And he has been sort of almost the poster child in the Christian rap game. He was the guy. He is the guy. Now he's even doing some producing. But Lecrae is a black man. And the racial realities of our world affect him just like they affect every other black man. And Lecrae began to process in kind of 2016 what it means to take his advantage that he's been given, this platform, this microphone, these eyes and ears that lean into him, and how can I use it to push people forward in helping them to maybe some of these people to understand what they can't understand unless I tell them. And so he released an album in September of 2017 called All Things Work Together. And this album blended some social and racial injustices and realities with giving people hope in Jesus. And Lecrae knew going in that it would maybe catch some people off guard. Not everybody would like it, because there were lyrics in these songs, bars that he would write, that some of them sounded like this. And I ain't trying to rap for you because, again, I told you I am not musical. But I want you to hear these words. This is from a song called Always Knew. And he said, still killing over colors. Now it's black and blue. We dying every day, B. We just don't make the news. When you speak out for your race, just watch. They're going to twist and say you hate these cops. I'm going to take these shots. How can he love Jesus, Kanye, and K-Dot? You don't know who K-Dot is? Google it, man. I ain't got time for you. How can Martin, Malcolm, and Schaefer, Mitsubishi, and Maybach? Contradictory? Nah, it's complementary. Understanding me ain't for the simple and elementary. And he goes on, he says, yeah, this might go over some heads, but I come from being government fed. Used to run from feds, but now I give the government bread because you're playing back the words that I said. Like, that was what was said in this song. And many tracks in the album have this woven into it because he was trying to help people see, trying to take his advantage and use it for the good of other people. He had been a success. He had made some money. He living in the suburbs, got to be like trying to help others. And take shots he did. I heard Lecrae talking not too long ago, and he said that on the album before this, he averaged more than 3,000 people per show that he would headline. Which, if you're unfamiliar with the music industry right now, basically artists, especially like a Cray, like not your top like 0.1% of artists, they make their money off their live shows because they're making nothing really off of streams. And so, I mean, to have more than 3,000 people on average at a show is a big deal. This was great. Things were booming. When he released this album and did the tour, he said they averaged fewer than 300 people per show. He said he expected to take a loss, take a hit, but not necessarily like this. It cost him a lot to take his advantage and begin to use it as leverage. And I get it. Because if you've been with us for a minute, you know that this series, this is not our first time to talk about race and racism. I have been speaking out for the whole of our church. It weaves into what I say and what I do, but it's also something we've addressed head on so many times. Why? Because it's Bible. Because racism and injustice is not in the heart of God. He says, I want justice, rivers of it. Come on, last week, I want oceans of fairness. That's what I want. But when I speak about race, I have people who say, man, I ain't coming to this church no more. We've had leaders leave the church because they say, we can't do this. One time I had a gentleman bold enough to come up to me after having preached on racism and tell me he didn't really appreciate some of what I said. I said, if I keep in this vein, he's going to withhold his giving, of which I reminded him two things. One, I don't know what you give. And two, nobody should give as gratuity to the preacher, but we all should give as worship to God. You ain't tipping me, we're worshiping God. When I give, I ain't tipping myself. I am worshiping God. Come on, that's why we give. And so I had to set him straight a little bit. But I understand. I mean, to a certain extent, like I get it. Like you say things and people get uncomfortable with them, even though they're rooted in God's word. And not everybody likes it. But the difference between privilege and leverage is how you use your advantage. And I recognize as a white male in America, I have an advantage because that's just the way it's been. But I have determined whatever it costs, I will use it as leverage with God as my help and my witness. Why? Because I believe in diversity. I believe that God's heart, the picture of the church that he sees, is young and old. It's rich and poor. It's black, brown, and white. It's all of us. And I wrote this down. But for diversity to be a reality, the advantage must recognize their advantage and leverage it for the good of those without the same advantage. This is our job if we have advantage of anything. That's why it's on those of us with a job to be generous and give. It's on those of us with extra time to serve God in his house. And I believe in this moment in history, in this time right now, it is particularly on people who are white to speak out, people who are white to stand up and not allow racism to live on to another generation. It's on us. But nobody recognizes their advantage without understanding other people's reality. You will never recognize the advantage that you have until you see the reality that somebody else lives in. I don't know if you've ever been on a missions trip, or maybe you don't even know what a missions trip is. It's something in the church space that we call these trips where groups of people will go to another country, many times developing countries, to be honest, and they may help build buildings or do little outreaches with missionaries and things that go on there. And I have a lot of thoughts about missions trips and the good and the bad and the ugly, and that's for another day. But there's something I've seen almost without fail on every missions trip. Because when you take a group of people and you go to particularly a city in a developing country, and you see hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of people living in what could only be described as a slum. I mean, a piece of lean-to material propped up, and that is someone's residence. They don't have privacy. They don't have walls. They don't have running water there. They just have a little bit of blockage from the rain and the heat. And then you come back to America and walk into whatever space you live, and you go in and you see that there's sheetrock and a ceiling fan and air conditioning and Wi-Fi and flooring, and you can close the door to your room. You can't help but recognize that you've been given an advantage. Like, there's no way to avoid that picture. Why? Because you have seen the reality that other people live in. And if I could just for a moment speak to the white people watching me right now. White people, I see you. I am you. Here's the thing. We have to take the time to understand the reality of what it is to be black in America. Because we don't understand the black experience firsthand. You don't. I don't. We don't. We can't. But we can learn more. I will never know what it's like to grow up and be a young black man in America. But I can listen, and I can read, and I can watch, and I can educate myself, and my empathy can grow because I have conversations with people who would trust me enough to share their stories with me. All of that can grow, and I can get somewhere, and I can begin then to see the advantage that I have because I see the reality that somebody else has. Jesus does something so profound here in Mark 11 and in Matthew and in Luke and in John that I think we miss. Jesus was not new to the temple. Jesus had been going to the temple his whole life. So when he comes in the book of John, and this is probably early in his ministry, 30, 31 years old, and he turns over tables probably for the first time. That's why John's recording it. This was not Jesus' first instance to see this. Luke tells us in Luke chapter 2 that Jesus was actually in the temple at 12 years old, and he was teaching, and other people were listening to him teach. He had been in and out of the temple his whole life, and he saw the system. He understood the system. And because he had taken the time, watch me, he had taken the time to understand, He had taken the time to see this isn't right and fair. This is not the picture that my Father has. Then, 30 years of observing this, he comes in and he says, no, this won't be anymore. But he took the time to understand how the system played out for, watch me again, people that weren't him. In the Old Testament, the leader Daniel does this. Daniel is an exceptional Hebrew man who has incredible influence in Babylon. I mean, their rulers, Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus and Darius, all come to Daniel saying, Daniel, tell us what we should do and how we should go. How does a Jewish man get so much influence in Babylon? Was it God? Yes, it was God, but it was also, don't miss what Daniel chapter 1 shows us. That Daniel took 3 years in their protege program. And he read what they read in Babylon. He listened to what they listened to in Babylon. He learned the history and the culture. And so then it gave him some credence and some understanding when it came time to speak into a different culture. Again, I'm talking to white people for a second, but white people, a lot of us have not done near enough homework to be talking as loud as we're trying to talk right now. Whether you're someone who's speaking out against the injustices and the atrocities that are going on or not, a lot of us haven't done enough of our homework. Some of us trying to be woke before we broke. We got our Bill Withers playlist and our Dr. King quote, and we think because we dropped a black square last Tuesday that all of a sudden now we are here to bring the change. Pump the brakes for a minute and try to understand the reality of somebody that isn't you. That you have advantages. I have advantages. And whether I use them as leverage for the good of others who don't have the same advantage or hold on to them as privilege is all up to me. But here's what I want to implore you with today. You don't have to say something to learn something. And maybe this is a moment, particularly for white people, particularly if this racial injustice, the racial injustices in our world is new to you. Maybe this would be a really good time to listen and to read and to learn before we formulate all of our opinions. To learn about the black experience that, and there is no pun intended here, but has been whitewashed for much of our history. Do you know about Black Wall Street? Are you familiar? Tulsa, Oklahoma, 99 years ago. And because of race, white people literally burned down one of the thriving economic centers in our country for black people. Burned down by white people. Don't know about it? Google it. You should read up. Do you know about Jim Crow laws? I'm sure you've heard about it. We live in the South. But do you know what they really said? Do you know how they were actually put into place? Who prospered and got advantage from them? And who was taken advantage of by them? You should read up on Jim Crow laws and learn a thing or two. Are you familiar with redlining? I know some people have dismissed it as myth, but what you can't dismiss as myth is literally what was written in the code of realtors at that time. That if you were a realtor and you sold a home to a black family in what was designated as a white neighborhood, you would lose your realtor license. Say, but I don't know about. It's the history. Do you know why Orange Mound matters? Some of you just know it's Orange Mound, it's the mound, it's in Memphis. Do you know why it matters? Because when black people were finally enabled to own and have property, there were only a couple places really leading the charge there. Harlem was one, Watts was one, and Orange Mound was another. But Orange Mound actually gave people the opportunity to own land. In Harlem, there was no land. You got your apartment. But in Orange Mound, you could have a front yard and a backyard with your freestanding house. That's why it matters. Are you familiar with vagrancy laws after the Civil War? Because a lot of us think, oh, well, slavery ended with the Civil War. Vagrancy laws would beg to differ. You should read up. You should read up about even the present reality. How at this moment in our history, we have a larger percentage of our black people living in America right now in jail than South Africa did at the height of the apartheid. And we think of the apartheid as being this horrible blight on humanity, of racism, like pulled to its fullest extent and thrown on a group of people. But what are we? See, I think that empathy that comes before woke is so important, because part of what happens there is our mind begins to be able to contextualize an experience that maybe we have not lived. Maybe we haven't had to feel personally. And if we never recognize the reality people in our country, specifically black people, have had to and are living through, we will never see white people the advantage that we've been given. Therefore, it has no choice but to become privileged. But I believe God is calling us as a church, as people who have a faith in him, to use whatever advantage, come on, this is any advantage, but whatever advantage as leverage for the good of all people. Because you don't have to post to bring progress, but there is cost to bring change. There's a cost. And so my request of all of us today is to look at our own lives and say, God, what advantages do I have? Some of us don't see how blessed we are in many areas. We don't see how fortunate we are. We don't see the advantages we've been given, like maybe for some people watching, white people who your race in this country gives you an advantage. We don't see it. Some of you've been blessed financially, whatever you don't see it because you just focus on yourself. And it's like we've got to back up for a second and look at the reality of other people. And that'll help us to see the advantage we've been given. And I believe then God will speak to us personally about what it is he calls us to next. Because it may be turning over the tables like Jesus did. Or it may be able to be a voice and be an influence in a culture that's not your own like Daniel was. I don't know. I do know that anytime you take your advantage and you leverage it for the good of others, you have to be willing to pay the cost. Let me pray for you today. Jesus, I thank you for these moments that we get to be together. Father, I pray, as I do every day, for protection. Protection for all of us, but specifically for my brothers and sisters who are black. Black people in this country who have been marginalized for far too long. God, protection, blessing on their lives. God, I pray for those of us who are not black. God, I pray you help us to recognize and understand a reality that is not our firsthand experience, but give us the grace and the empathy and the passion to learn so that our heart would be broken like yours, so that maybe we would take a stand like Jesus did, even though it cost him everything. We would take a stand so that your house would look the way you want your house to look. God, I love you and I thank you. I pray all these things in your precious name. Amen. Amen.